we come to the last sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 152, the Indriyabhavana Sutta, which means the development of the faculties, that is, the sense faculties. Okay, in this sutta, the sutta opens when a certain young Brahmin student, who is a disciple of some famous Brahmin named Parasarya, comes to the Buddha and exchanges greetings with him. And then the Buddha asks this young student, Brahmin student, how his master teaches his disciples about the development of the faculties, Indriyabhavana. It seems this must have been an expression that was used amongst the circles of ascetics in the time of the Buddha, and each master would develop his own way, his own special method of training and developing the faculties, the sense faculties. And so first the Buddha asks this Brahmin student whether his master teaches them the development of the faculties, and the student says that he does. Then the Buddha says, how does he teach his disciples the development of the faculties? Then the Brahmin student says, according to his teacher, one should not see any forms with the eye, and one should not hear any sounds with the ear. It doesn't mention that one shouldn't smell any scents with the nose, that one shouldn't taste any flavors with the tongue, or feel any tactile objects with the body. Those are the other 5 physical sense faculties. But with the eye, I guess one could always keep the eyes closed or downcast, and if one wants to practice very diligently restraint of the faculties, then one can stuff one's ears with wax or some kind of substance to prevent sounds from coming in. So apparently this master, this Brahmin master, thought that the only way to overcome the desire and aversion that arise through the senses is by completely closing off the senses so that they don't have any access to their objects. In a way, this kind of practice is somewhat related, perhaps, to the practice of self-mortification. It's a kind of, it works on the presupposition that as long as we are exposed to sense objects, then we inevitably become their prisoners. That the only way we can escape attachment to sense objects, the only way we can avoid the dualistic reactions of attraction and repulsion, interest and aversion, is by blocking off entirely the access to sense objects. If one really were to take this mode of practice far enough, then one should even find a way to block the nostrils so that no smells come in. And one has to eat, but one should eat only the most the blandest, those tasteless foods. And one should even try to insulate the body so that one doesn't touch any material objects. Of course, there's a 6th sense also, the mind faculty, which has its own objects. And perhaps the ascetics who follow this mode of practice would try to enter into a state of meditative absorption in which the mind is completely cut off from any experience and just enters into a complete blank thoughtless state of mind. Okay, so when the Brahmin student gives his reply to the Buddha, then the Buddha says that if this is the case, then a blind man and a deaf man would have well-developed faculties. They would have mastery over the sense faculties. For a blind man doesn't see any forms with the eyes, and the deaf man doesn't hear any sounds with the ears. And the Buddha might have gone on to mention that the most highly developed person would be the one who is blind and deaf together, since that person doesn't see and doesn't hear. Okay, when the Buddha gave that reply, then the Brahmin student must have realized that in a way he was stumped. He probably gave his reply thinking that the Buddha would praise him, or praise his master, and say, your master is teaching the correct way. I teach exactly the same thing. But the Buddha didn't agree with the reply of his teaching. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe that, anyway, it is, as our doctor will know, you can put wax and wax and wax in your ear, you will still hear when the ear is intact. It will only, what is that called, muffle your sound, but you cannot avoid that. That is already there, it is in the mechanism already wrong. No?
Yeah, I should mention that there are techniques that have developed now, techniques of complete sensory deprivation. I think there are even what they call sensory deprivation tanks, where one goes in and literally one doesn't see anything when there's absolutely no sense experience. All the sense experience is cut off.
The sound is still there, and it is the sound of your heartbeat, and it's the sound of your bloodstream and all that. And there is a deprivation of what we usually are listening to.
But then when people undergo complete sensory deprivation, if they don't have prior mind training, then the mind starts conjuring up all sorts of fantasies.
Or fear.
And fear also.
Terrible fear in Hungary. It can be, without preparation, there can be a terrible kind of fear, no? Because you are losing something which you are so used to.
Okay, so when the Buddha gave his answer, then this young Brahmin student sat there, unable to reply. He was completely, you say, baffled by the Buddha's reply, completely dejected. Okay. Then the Buddha, in order to give a kind of cue to Ananda, indicating that he wants to give an explanation, to give a discourse, he says to Ananda that the Brahmin Parasarya teaches his disciples one type of development of the faculties, but in the Arya Vinaya, the discipline of the noble ones, the supreme development of the faculties is different. Then when he says this, then Venerable Ananda pleads with him, now is the time, Blessed One, now is the time for the Blessed One to teach the supreme development of the faculties in the discipline of the noble ones. Okay, so now the Buddha starts to teach, and he will teach 3 stages in the development of the sense faculties. 3 ways to master the sense faculties. So 3 levels in the mastery of the sense faculties. Usually when the Buddha speaks about mastering the sense faculties, he uses a particular fixed formula which comes in the Pali Canon. This is the formula on the restraint of the senses. This formula says that when the monk sees a form with the eye, then he does not become attracted to, then he restrains the faculty of the eye as it goes. Okay, on seeing a form with the eye, he does not grasp at its sign and features. That is the general characteristic of the form, or its particular detailed features. Since if he left the eye faculty unguarded, then such evil, unwholesome states as greed and aversion might overcome him. He practices the way of its restraint, he guards the eye faculty, and he undertakes the restraint of the eye faculty. That is the usual formula which indicates the training that is to be taken up by a monk at the very beginning of his practice, before he reaches the higher stages. But here in this sutta, the Buddha doesn't introduce that method, because that method is a more elementary method, which is meant for monks at the beginning of their training. Here the Buddha is going to use a method that applies vipassana, or insight, to the sensory experience in order to overcome any kind of defilement, any kind of attachment that might arise, and to develop a state of equanimity towards the sensory experience. Okay, so now the Buddha gives his explanation. Okay, when a monk sees a form with the eye, there arises in him what is agreeable. There arises what is disagreeable. There arises what is both agreeable and disagreeable. I'll write the Pali words. Okay, the word for agreeable is manapa, the word disagreeable, amanapa, and what is agreeable and disagreeable, that is manapa and amanapa. I think you have this word in singular also, don't you? Okay, so it's immediately clear. Now, normally in the suttas, this word agreeable and disagreeable, these words agreeable and disagreeable, are used to qualify the object of perception. So the texts speak of agreeable forms, disagreeable forms, and so on. But here, I have to say the commentary is not helpful at all on this. It seems that what is meant by agreeable, disagreeable, and disagreeable are the reactions to the sense object, the states of mind that arise on the occasion of perception. So here, when it said that something agreeable arises, what seems to be meant is some kind of liking for a particular sense object, some interest in it, some desire for it, some degree even of lust for it. And naturally, desire, liking, attachment will arise in response to a pleasant sense object. So that is not necessarily the case. Some people enjoy undergoing pain. And what seems to be meant by what is disagreeable here is not exclusively a disagreeable object, but some dislike for the object, some aversion, some antagonism towards the object. Generally, the aversion and antagonism that will arise towards an unpleasant object, a disagreeable object. But again, it's not necessarily the case. Some people can become averse even towards a beautiful or disagreeable object. And then what is both agreeable and disagreeable, that seems to be perhaps some kind of mixed reaction to an object. Something sometimes feeling some degree of liking, sometimes a degree of dislike. Or it can also be the neutral state of dull equanimity, not the bright, sublime equanimity of true detachment, but rather the dull equanimity of just being indifferent towards some neutral object. Okay, now in this case, the Buddha explains how the monk responds on such occasions. And here it's not a matter of the monk drawing back the sense faculty from the object, as in the training that's given to the monks in the early stages. But rather, the monk is instructed to apply a particular type of contemplation to the sense object and to his reaction to the object in order to dispel that reaction, to change the reaction from one of attachment, aversion, or dullness to one of true equanimity. And so what the meditator does is to consider the inner experience, that inner reaction of liking, disliking, or indifference. And he also can apply the same character, the same method to the object. He considers that this experience is something conditioned. Okay, the experience of liking, of desire, for example, is conditioned by the sense faculty. It's conditioned by the object. So it's not something absolute, something existing in itself. And it's also conditioned by many internal factors, one's own prior experiences. For example, say, okay, maybe for some people who have lived for a long time in South Asia, then if they go to America and they see, say, men who have grown up in South Asia, if they go to America and they see American women for the first time, they think that, oh, they're all ugly, because their prior conditioning is to enjoy South Asian feminine features. And so if they go to another country in the West, then all the women look ugly because they have European features. I remember many years ago when I was in graduate school, there was a Tibetan monk who came to live in the town where I went to school, Tibetan Buddhist monk. Then he told his adopted parents, the parents who adopted him, that he thought that all the American women were homely. He said, how can men like women with such white skins and light-colored hair? But then what I heard several years later was that he had disrobed and married one.
But you have also to say that homely in American language means a different thing than homely in English. Homely in the English in Britain means nice, she is working.
Oh, that's I see.
Yes, but in America it is a very unpleasant kind of
Okay, so in that way one is conditioned by sight, or somebody who is maybe grown up, we'll take the opposite way, listening to Western classical music, then maybe when they hear Indian classical music, the ragas, then it just sounds like cacophony to them. But if one gets used to listening, then one learns the structure of the music, then one can appreciate it. And then not to speak of music, but people come from Europe, the West, come to Sri Lanka, India, and eat the Sri Lankan food, Indian food, and it's just burning the mouth. And all I can taste are the spices and the chili. But after some time one gets used to it, and then one can enjoy it and develop attachments to this type of food. So in this way one's likings, dislikings are based also on internal conditioning. Okay, then one considers that this experience, this conditionally arisen experience, because it's conditioned, it's something gross. It's gross also because it's arising through the senses. It's dependent upon the eye and forms, the ear and sounds. And especially for a meditator who has experienced much more refined and exalted inner states of perhaps the jhanas, the insight knowledges, then this sensory experience, whether pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, is something which is gross, and for that reason to be something to become detached from. And it is also dependently arisen through causes and conditions. And so by contemplating the sensory experience in this way, by contemplating the reaction to it in this way, as conditioned by various factors, as gross because it's sensory, and is dependently arisen, then one has subjected it to the basic framework for insight knowledge. And in fact, when one applies this particular mode of contemplation to it, looks at the experience in this way, then one will also see that it is impermanent, because it's conditioned, arisen through different causal factors. When those conditioning factors subside, the experience subsides. So it's impermanent. What's impermanent is unsatisfactory or suffering. What is impermanent, suffering, subject to change, not mine, not I, not myself. So it's anatta, non-self. Then one compares this experience with the inner experience of equanimity, an equanimity that one has known previously through one's experience in meditation. And so one realizes that this is much more peaceful. This is a much more exalted and refined state, the equanimity. And then when one reflects on the experience in this way, then the agreeable that arose, that is the liking, the attachment to the object, the disagreeable that arose, the disliking, the aversion, the repugnance towards the object, and the mixture of both, the combination of liking and disliking, these states pass from him and equanimity becomes established. According to the sub-commentary to the Majjhima Nikaya, this equanimity is what is called Sankharupeka. That is the equanimity towards formations. It's not just the ordinary neutral state of equanimity, but the meditator here, by applying this particular framework of contemplation to the object, has set up a foundation for insight knowledge. And through that insight knowledge, seeing the true nature of the phenomena, he develops the equanimity towards formations that arises from insight. Okay, then the Buddha illustrates this with one of his remarkable similes. He says that just as a man with good sight could When his eyes are open, he might shut them, or when his eyes are shut, he might open them. Just something very simple to do, something that he can do immediately as soon as he thinks of it. So, concerning anything at all, the Buddha says, the agreeable that arose, the disagreeable that arose, and the both agreeable and disagreeable that arose, cease just as quickly, just as rapidly, just as easily, and equanimity is established. This simile and the way the Buddha develops it, this seems to indicate that the monk who is practicing in this way is one who is really already quite well established in his meditation, because he's able to shift the mind away from that defiled mental state into the pure equanimity almost just by an act of will, or just by setting up that framework of contemplation. Then the Buddha says, this is called, in the Noble One's discipline, the supreme development of the faculties in regard to forms cognizable by the eye. Okay, now the Buddha goes to each of the other sense faculties, and the pattern of contemplation is the same in each case. The only thing that differs are the similes. In regard to the sounds heard through the ear, the Buddha gives a simile of just as a strong man, or any man in fact, could very easily just snap his fingers. So concerning anything at all, one can develop this restraint of the faculties in regard to any sound. In regard to odors that one might smell through the nose, the simile is that of raindrops on a lotus leaf, a slanting lotus leaf. When the raindrops hit the lotus leaf, they immediately roll off without sticking to it. And so these states of liking, disliking, and the mixture of both, as soon as the monk sets up this contemplation, they immediately roll off and equanimity is established. In the case of tastes or flavors that one will taste through the tongue, the simile is that of a strong man who could spit out a ball of spit from the tip of his tongue. Just chip, and the spit is out. There's no problem. And so in the same way, the meditating monk will spit out these liking, disliking, and the mixture of both, and return to equanimity. In the case of tactile objects, it is just as a strong man might extend his flexed arm or flex his extended arm, so the meditating monk can change his mind from the liking and disliking